this, huh? Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on when you decided to watch this. I am Mr. Brad Chester here with Mr. Matt Aaron, talking about part 3, week 5, correct? Of the ongoing journey of the flagship Brad and Matt are at the Adepticon. I'll go.
Yeah, we're week 5. I don't know how we made it. But somehow we're almost there, man. We're almost there.
I love everything about this. So let's talk about the actual mission itself. The plan was build and paint a competitive 2,000 point Necron army in 6 weeks for Adepticon. It's got to be competitive on the tabletop. It's got to be something that you can actually really achieve, though. That is one of the biggest things that you started with was, I'm going to try to do this in a very truncated time frame compared to things you've done before, and basically stay motivated and stay on point. And that was part of what we do here. So let's get a status update. Tell me about weeks 1 through 4 and going into week 5. Tell me where we are.
Yeah, so pretty much almost about 95% fully built. I had some delays because I had actually took Brad's advice and decided to actually make Grim Reaper style riders on the Tomb Blades, but they're taking forever.
Come on now. At least pick them up. I want to
All right, so kind of what they're going to look like so far.
I love everything. The best is I have no part in modeling this. And I was like, you know, it'd be really cool. Some Grim Reapers with flowing cloaks. And you're like, you know, what'd be really cool is if I didn't know you. So
Yeah, it's again, I think I bit off way more than I could chew because they don't fit. Like you have to like totally shave down the Necron, make them fit just at the right angle, and then you have to pin the actual like where the skeleton arms are. You got to pin Necron arms and somehow make that work. So it's been a lot of shaving, a lot of sculpting. So, but I actually really think they look awesome. So it's kind of delayed me a little bit in terms of production, but definitely I think it'll be worth it because I can catch things up in the back end. Kind of speaking to my own almost advice to myself of giving myself a little bit like of squish time to catch up. I'm still waiting on the actual Nightbringer model that I want to receive. Apparently, it should be here in the States any day now, and they can ship to me, so that'd be good. And I think there's a few more conversion things that kind of slowed me down in terms of the bases and things like that. But overall, I think it's in a great spot. I decided because the rates are so heavy, I used plastic bases and then cork and then put these like ruin plates on top to kind of make it look like it's like a Necron temple ruin. But the rates kept falling over. So for model plates, not going to work. So I went ahead and purchased some just flat resin bases, and I can build a cork on top of that, and that will add a lot of extra weight. Plus, you can magnetize the bases then, and they can for easier transportation. So still waiting on those, but since I've already made a few bases, they're actually pretty quick to make. We'll talk more about that hopefully next week, right before Adepticon, to kind of let you know where I'm at for it. But yeah, now as I wait for those products to kind of come in the mail, now I'm actually moving on to painting. So this week I actually started actually busting out the airbrush, started painting, and really kind of happy with the progress we're making so far. It's just gonna take a little bit of time because I only gave myself until week 5 to start painting, so I only have 2 full weeks to paint, unfortunately, out of the steps that I myself.
I do love the questioning the dark turquoise army. Tell me about this, and I'm going to take us into the updated timeline also.
Yeah, so as I kind of build up this kind of specific scheme, I'm not too sure. I really like how the armor looks. Again, I'm not dry brushing at all. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but I definitely am kind of thinking about if I like the Incubi Darkness armor against some of the other elements. So I'm kind of deciding if I actually want to go for a textured surface or if I want to keep it just flat Incubi Darkness and then kind of maybe just like scuff up some of the edges. So that's what I'm kind of still figuring out. But luckily, I can continue to paint the rest of the models while I kind of figure that out. I'm not kind of just stuck making a decision. I can work on other stuff and can kind of revisit that when I have a fresh set of eyes. So, yeah.
What's easier? What's better for you on that? Like if you were if this was not truncated by time, what would you prefer on that?
That's a good question. I think I'll do a few more test models to see how I like it. Problem is I'm doing all this in batch painting, so you kind of have like an assembly line, and I'm at the point now where like, hey, I have to make a decision for the whole army. If I had a little bit more time, I'd play some things out, maybe test a few things out. So I'm actually having to use my phone. If you go on your phone, you can like edit a few photos and like just use like your finger to draw a few things up. And so I'm kind of using that to kind of just get us some general ideas if I like how well it's balancing with the other colors. Now the trick is though is you need to have you got to think of the whole model and composition, which I'll talk here about in a little bit. But if I had a little bit more time, I definitely would try things out, and I wouldn't feel a rush to like, hey, let me take a week or two to think about this big decision. You know, it's expensive army. You want to like make the best decision for you. But now I don't have a week to think about it. I have like days to think about it. So in lieu of being able to like pull out a whole model and paint it, I'm just gonna go ahead and try some other stuff.
So let's talk. We got the updated time up here. So you're pretty much on time. Third week, fourth week, and we got the fifth week of actually starting to paint and build the display board. And then of course you've got your conference here. Let's talk about the timeline, but I actually want to go into let's talk about the tips for quick and effective paint scheme because of the fact you're doing a ton of this. So let's just talk about where you are on the time frame, but also why besides me only using contrast paint, because that's the only thing I've been able to use in my new painting journey, which is a little less in than yours.
Yeah, so contrasts are more contrast paints are kind of a tool. At first, I kind of didn't like the idea of contrast paints as they're intended. Just take a model, slap this on, play it. I think it was kind of really cheating your ability to learn color theory, to learn how to highlight and volume, to create contrast with, washes to create shadows, and then edge highlights, dry brushes to create, the highlights. And so I didn't like the idea of it because I felt like it was too simplistic. It really wasn't training you to be kind of an artist or whatever that may look like for you in terms of your hobby journey. But what I've been using them more of is diluting them down, the contrast paints, and using them more like really pigmented washes and getting some really cool effects. If you like, I did that more with my Death Guard army. The purples were base, I think like Phoenix purple from GW, and then washed it with diluted contrast and create a really rich purple. And I also like the finish of contrast paints. So I've been using them a little bit more as washes for this project, especially with the metals. But I think that's kind of helping push things. And so with this army, you have to realize, hey, I don't have time to paint everything, base coat it, and then actually start, washing it and now slowly build up all the highlights meticulously. I don't have time for that. So now I have to start using other ways of including weathering while also, hey, can I add some highlights here using different approaches? So contrast is a way of doing it because contrast is the number one thing for today. If there's one thing you learn, I'm going to call it the Mike Fox method because he's phenomenal at this, is pushing contrast really hard. So when you think of painting, think of contrast. I want the shadows to be as dark as I can. I want the highlights to be as bright as they possibly can be within reason. Almost going to pure black, almost going to pure white, but not, exactly. Or also look kind of funny. So again, think about this too. Where do we often play Warhammer events? We play them in big convention halls or big open settings, and the lighting's often terrible. So in your own, paint studio or your desk or whatever you're painting up, it could look brilliant, but then you go to these convention halls, everything looks super drab. So you really have to punch the contrast. You got to make things that are bright, super bright, and things that are dark, almost super dark. And almost do it itself, but definitely push your highlights as hard as you can toward the brightest you possibly can without making it looking too pastel-y. It's really important. Now you can also I'm talking about contrast in terms of just black to white and pushing contrast along that. But there's other ways of playing with contrast. That's what I'm doing with this army. You could also play with different colors. You have a cool color that's like a blue or a purple against a warm color, a red and orange. So you can kind of, by pairing those two colors together, they'll naturally contrast against each other. But you want to somehow make it work. You can also play around with surfaces. Like for example, this Necron army, a lot of metallics. so they're super smooth. So you got to break that up a little bit, either by adding, some sponge work to create some weathering in the armor, or those turquoise armor plates, you can stipple and make texture on there too. So by putting a smooth surface against a rough, coarse surface, you can also play with that. As best as possible. So again, there's different ways of playing with either textures on the models by building them or painting them, or awful different color values. There's different ways of kind of pushing it a little bit other than just going dark to white a little bit. So I want to include, again, everyone knows there's tons of videos out there. I highly recommend Kenny Boucher's Next Level Painting. That's how I learned in turn, and then kind of took it the next level. But definitely the quickest way you can possibly paint an army is just take an airbrush, create volumes. Take your model. Actually, I'll use mine. Take this model, take an airbrush, paint it all black. Then take white and just paint straight down. And then when you paint your base coats, just go ahead and paint the base coat everywhere, but then do your highlights either from here or a 45-degree angle. Because as you do it like this with your airbrush, what's happening, it's going to leave the underside dark. And your highest bright, the brightest bright, you're do straight down. So this is called making volumes. You're making dark under here, your medium tones, and your light tones. So just by creating volumes with a quick airbrush or even dry brushing, I'm going to dry brush some dark grays down here, some medium grays, and some white on top, and then using contrast paint for slap chop. That's another way of kind of creating some additional kind of highlights in your base coats beforehand. And then you take a wash. I always recommend diluting your washes a little bit using armor paint or quick shade medium, or using the contrast paint specific. Again, when you dilute a wash, it's very important. Don't use water. Don't use water when diluting a contrast paint, because it will really mess it up. Spend the $7 for the contrast paint. You'll thank yourself, the contrast paint medium. You'll thank yourself later, because what it does is that if you just use water, it breaks the molecules in the chain and it will not set right. But by using medium, it actually fills in the chain and actually gives you the effect that you want. So again, if you're going to slap chop, you can just apply straight contrast. But if you want to use contrast paints over other stuff, it's really important to be careful with that. So again, say you take your model, you've done your airbrushing, you got your washes. Now your model's in what I call, or I should say Kenny calls, the hot garbage phase. It's super drab, super dark.
Tell me about the hot. I felt like all my models were in the hot garbage phase. So
Again, I mean, come up with this name. Everyone who's seen a model knows this stage, whether you've heard of this term or not. It's called the hot garbage phase. I've taken my model, I've made it as dark as possible, and it's super drab, desaturated. It looks really bland. And that's what happens when you go to most events. Most events just have washes with no highlights. Everything looks super drab. Hot garbage phase. Your job then, or your next step in this process, is to go back and add those highlights. But by sealing everything in, after you've had the washes, and then now you can actually put them on your bases, you actually have an armor you can use now. But you have to go back and add those highlights to brighten it up. People see, don't go underneath the chassis of things or underneath things. Just go top down for quick highlights, or use a quick dry brush to kind of really make those edges pop, and it will make a huge difference, especially when you're against another army that's super drab. So definitely go back and add those highlights, to kind of take yourself out of that phase. But it's hard because you've done all this work to clean your models, build your models, apply everything, started doing all the base coats, and now I'm exhausted and now I have to start adding actual highlights. So it can be really demotivating to be at this step, but this is the step where you really need to push through it as best as possible. So again, everyone's been at that point of the hot garbage phase, but you just got to keep pushing through it, and then it's going to really sing. So it's like right before the dawn. It's really dark, but now the sun's going to come up as you start adding those highlights.
I like what's happening here. Give me some additional tips. Dedicate the time.
All right, so
tell me about this.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of gave myself 6 weeks. Still kind of regretting this decision. I've had to cut a few corners, but not as I've had to make as many compromises as I thought I would. So I'm really kind of happy in that regard, but definitely would hopefully have liked a little bit more time. But you got to dedicate the time. If you want a great product, then you have to actually dedicate the time, not only to put into the model, but also your own practice. So I recommend, like always, create a schedule. That's what I did, as you'll see from the past few videos, create a schedule and then build in some, benchmarkers to say, hey, am I right on track or am I really far behind? I need some help. You may recruit a buddy for a hobby night or something to kind of help catch up. Different ways of doing it, and allow again some gaps in there so you can catch up a little bit if needed. And if you don't need to utilize those gaps at all, well, that's the time you go back and add the actual spice to your army in terms of details and flavor to it. So that's not going to go unutilized.
So tell me
I
about,
always recommend. Go ahead.
just tell me a little bit about. I want to go to the bottom of the slide for me, because the fantasy versus reality. So when you're painting this, and you're setting up your timetable and trying to get into it, are you painting a model and timing it down? Tell me like how that went into it to basically get not a fan of, I've seen tons of people make, I'm going to paint everybody as well. They paint an HQ first and they take forever to paint this one model. It looks amazing. And then they're like, oh, I have to paint 1,800 more points now. And then the rest of the army doesn't look like that. So do you paint completely from point A to point B, one model, like the whole journey, or do you just start looking at the colors that you think you'll be able to use and the technique you're able to use?
Mhm. Yeah, I highly recommend take one model and paint it. You don't have to be super specific with it, but definitely paint it swiftly, but definitely to the way you think you want it. The reason I say this is that we have all sorts of fantasies of what we want our army to look like, but can we actually achieve it? Or, hey, I have this new color scheme I want to try out. In my head, it works, but let me put it actually, brush to model and see how long it takes me to achieve that effect. It takes me a long, long time. Well, maybe it's not the best color scheme to go with. Or, hey, actually, in my head, I thought these colors would go well, but now I see it on the model and it's just not singing for me. It's not really having the effect I had. So people have all sorts of fantasies of how we want our army to look. Or we look at Instagram and we see so many different, armies out there, or professional painters painting beautiful armies, and then I go to do it and I'm like, wait, it's not exactly how I'd want it. So by doing a test model, you can actually feel more confident in your scheme, that you're not going to like paint 90% of an army and realize I hate it and have to strip it. But also it'll kind of give you the confidence to know, like, hey, I can do this and it's not that hard to achieve these results. Or maybe I paint up the model, I'm like, I like the colors, but maybe there's an easier way to get to this point, whether I can just get this achieved by using slap chop, or I can get this achieved by using contrast paint or washes. So I always highly recommend take one model, an infantry model, something like that, to try to test things out to make sure it actually will actually work for you, and you'll thank yourself later once you do that.
Now let's talk about this piece that you put together just to spite me. That's how I feel like this is here. We're going to talk about a quick lesson in color theory.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's
Yes.
stuff happening here.
Yeah, so Brad just sees Shades of Gray. I know his color not that bad, but
color lazy. Color lazy. Thank
color
you.
lazy, color lazy. But I wanted to kind of give a little tip for those of you watching to reward you, for taking the time to watch this video, to give you a quick lesson that painting, in terms of picking colors, is much easier than you think. Sometimes we feel very overwhelmed when we see accomplished painters, and we think there's no way I can possibly do that. The colors just look like on point. But it's actually very, very simple. So I created a quick color wheel for you, and I want to kind of paint two things. So again, we'll use ultramarines is a kind of standard example. So let's start with blue. All right. So you've picked blue as the main color you want your army. So then, hey, I got to pick what other colors go with it. So as long as you've picked the primary color, everything else is kind of falling into place. So you have a color that's opposite to it would be what? An orange there, So orange would be the opposite of blue, in this color wheel. So if I want my two primary colors, I probably should have blue as my primary, but then having orange as a secondary color. And most of the army should play around with that. Now, say I have a project that has, three areas that I really want to emphasize. So in which case, instead of just being a linear, blue to orange, let's create a triangle here. So you would have blue, kind of like an orangey red, and then you would have kind of like a lime green, or you'd kind of play around with those colors. So when we say that, you kind of realize, hey, you're trying to create a pyramid with your colors. So if I pick blue, well, maybe I'll have some, green elements in there in terms of the energy glow and things like that. And then maybe some orange on some other shoulder pads and things like that too. So just giving you an idea, really basic, if you're really struggling with an army or what other colors to pick, or maybe I have my two colors picked out, we'll just put them on this color wheel and say, hey, how do I make a pyramid with these colors to really be harmonious? They're opposites, but if you have them in the right combination, they actually can sing really well together. And realizing too, this is just looking at primary colors. We're not even talking about the, really light red to really dark reds. That's next level stuff. But there's different ways you can kind of play around with it. But I want to explain this a little bit to let you know that when you pick a color for an army, it's really simple to pick out the other colors, depending on what your project is. So I always go back to the color wheel if I'm really struggling, or hey, I really can't make this work. And this is just a kind of a guiding principle for me. But
Well, tell me how you do the Void Reaver colors. We have the Void Reaver color selection here. And
yes, so there's a lot of metal. So it's Necrons, right? A lot of metal. But every army at Adepticon, every Necron army is going to be metal with washes, dry brush. I'm going to look like every other model out there. So I got to really stand out. So by using a diluted contrast paint, I can actually add more of a blue metallic sheen to my metals that will really make them stand out. So I went ahead and picked, since it's more of an emerald, like a light grayish, greenish blue. I went ahead and put the primary color on that green and light blue line, somewhere to be turquoise. So then I had to start thinking, okay, if I want to have some other colors in there, what will that look like? So if I'm using my color wheel, well, I better have some purples in there, and I better have some oranges in there too. So how do I make this work? So I'm going to be playing a little bit with the actual type of emeralds that I'm using. I'm going to use a dark emerald, a medium emerald, and a light emerald. And that's like really advanced theory about doing that just right. But you do that by also using whites and blacks in terms of like your neutral colors. But I'm in the shadows. How can I sneak in another color in the shadows? I'm going to sneak in some purples. Your eye might not catch it right away, but the shadows in these models are actually going to be a dark purple. And then but now that you know purple's there, you go to look for it, and now you'll see it. But your eye will just see it a little bit differently when you're looking at the model. So by sneaking in purples, it will blend well with the emerald armor. Now, what about orange? How do I sneak orange in there a little bit? So it won't play that well. So maybe I can sneak in some oranges in the base, by having some weathering, things like that. So by sneaking in some orangey rust in the base, that's another way of creating contrast between the base and the model in a good way. So again, having these elements in there was a way of creating contrast so they're separate, but still being harmonious together when they kind of come together. So again, just an idea if you're struggling for, hey, what color rush I should do? Let's do more of an orangey rush. Hey, what kind of shadow should I have? Maybe having some purples in your shadow can play pretty well in this regard. So this kind of like applying the color theory to this army.
let's look at the paint scheme as far as where you're putting stuff, because I like this. This was my favorite slide because you're trying to show where you're going to put each thing. How do these go together? Tell me how you're making not even just making this happen, but tell me why you decided that the certain things, subtle purples, shadows for the metals, strip dark turquoise armor for texture, dark gold for small accent. Why did you choose each one of these things as opposed to just, obviously all the painters are going to throw stuff at me and go, Brad, shut your face. But I was just wondering why you chose for other people watching.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good point too, because we don't know what we don't know. What I mean by that is that, hey, we're trying to maybe we're new in the hobby and we just want to take a next step, or maybe we're really far advanced and actually want to learn a new technique or two. So with these colors, I thought, hey, I want to make a Necron army that maybe no one's seen, or maybe people have seen it, but I want to add my flair to it. So it can't be just airbrush silvers, wash and dry brush. That's not me. I'm not standing out at all. But what's a way of a technique that I can use that's quick, effective, but really stands out? Well, maybe utilizing this. So this slide shows the bulk of the model, like proportionally what the colors are going to look like and how you kind of sneak them in. So what you're going to see is a lot of these metallics are kind of this like light turquoise, like I don't want to say it's a kind of a grayish blue, grayish green. So that's what a lot of the metals are going to look like, not just your standard silver to black. The recesses are going to be a little darker tone, the highlights with stippling, with a bright silver will create edge highlights, but also create a little bit of weathering. So you'll see by stippling on things that you can actually create different effects and textures and things like that. So majority of it will be that color. Well, I got to mess around with other turquoise then. So the armor will be a dark turquoise, and I haven't decided if I want to stipple that or not, or just keep it flat. We'll see how much I got to break things up. But again, I have my base metallic color, and now I have my other primary color, which is going to be a dark turquoise for the armor. Well, the energy, by making it a very light emerald green, can kind of also contrast well. So the energy will all be this light green color. After painting Death Guard for 4 years, I am neon greened out. Like I cannot paint another fluorescent green in my life. That's all I did. And I love them. They look great at Death Guard. But for this army, I wanted to stick to more of an emerald green effects. I think it just looks a little bit cooler. It looks a little cooler than standard green. But also it stands out because not a lot of people are doing it that way. So we got these metals. Well, how do we actually break up all this metal? I'm actually going to make some black metals in there too. So that will kind of also help to break up the different styles of the metals. You have the actual kind of like, I would say skin armor on the Necrons, but then you have like the metal metals, like the machinery parts or the blades or things like that. So by creating like light silver with dark silver, you can actually distinguish the type of material on the Necron model itself. So you got to break up the Necron model a little bit. So by making, a lighter silver with a darker silver, still metallic, but you're able to kind of play around with the different qualities of what the actual surface is, the material you're going for. And then by adding the colors, you're able to kind of also add a little bit more interest. So I'm playing around with not only contrast in terms of different colors, but also within using lighter colors and darker colors. That's kind of the next level stuff a little bit. Again, sneaking some purples there. Your eye may or may not catch it, but it's definitely there. And then also I'm going to add a little bit of like Balthasar gold, like a dark gold a little bit on a few of the ruins and things like that. Not much. Just enough to create a little bit more interest. So again, you don't want to just throw a bunch of colors on there. You want things to sing, and that's where I'm at now in terms of maybe adding this dark turquoise color. Everything else kind of plays well together, but for each model is a little bit different. Also, what color I'm going to do the cloaks. Do I do them black? Do I do them like a very dark incubi darkness? I'm not too sure yet. So that's something else that I'm gonna have to test out a little bit on a model and kind of run with it. So we'll see. But this slide I think does a lot. It talks about the proportions of the colors, talks about the primary colors, and then talks about the secondary colors. So it's a very busy slide, but I think it kind of lets you see what the army is going to generally kind of look like.
I mean, this helped a lot for me. This is why it was my favorite in this. It was me looking at, because I like the fact that you did the different, how much of the model is going to be per the color on that. You know what I mean? That makes more sense to me. Being in my not even Padawan status, my neophyte, barely understand status of paint.
Yeah, most Necron armies are going to be three colors. They're going to be all silver. They're going to be maybe the armor is going to be like dark green with light green edges, and then maybe some neon green glow. Like that's going to be every Necron army there. And so you really got to stand out. So by adding different colors, it's a way of standing out a little bit. So again, I'm talking about this Necron army a bit, but that's what you should be thinking of. If I have way too much surface area, I got to find a way of cleverly breaking it up, or else it looks really boring. I mean, if you want a really boring looking army, that's fine. But if you want to create some interest, you can definitely throw in some other colors there, just to kind of draw your eye to something to be unique. But make sure it still plays well with the other colors around it. That's something I can't recommend enough, is that how much more your army will pop if you just change one color a little bit, compared to every other army that's out there. If you're really true to the lore and you want your armies to look exactly like the book, go for it. Also, this is something I haven't mentioned that much, but look online, like Google something, look on Instagram, Pinterest. Like there's tons of cool models out there, or you see an art photo and you want to recreate it, find some sort of inspiration and kind of recreate that. And if you're really struggling with the technique the person used, just message them on Instagram or, see if you can hunt them down somewhere on Facebook. They'll be cool about it, but maybe send a message, say, hey, love your stuff, really struggling to create this effect. What did you use? And they're more likely to tell you how they did it because guess what? At one point in time, that person was struggling to up and come somewhere and someone squared them away or gave them some advice or some input. So
100%.
this hobby community really connects. So definitely reach out.
Let's talk about these work in progress because you've got some stuff circled for me, and I'm even wearing my colorblind glasses just so I can see a little bit more today.
Yeah, so again, this is taken really roughly, but I want to kind of show you a little bit how you see the purples there on the model. Well, you see, like for these guys, they're bright silver, but a little bit off. So these guys specifically are more chrome based because they're the leaders, so they should really be perfect. Chrome really spread out. So these ones are a little bit brighter in terms of their scheme. But you'll also see on the lower circle how I've introduced a little bit of a cloak there, and I've added some few extra bits. So again, you're seeing the different colors we're sneaking in there, but also checking out some of the conversions that I threw in.
Love it. Let's look at some of the Doomstalkers here because you were talking about last week about the putting the legs on these and putting different, your different conversions on it. Are you happy with how those legs turned out?
Yeah, I think this took a while. This took a lot longer than I would expect because the Triart Stalker legs are built for a very big base. So I couldn't get even pinning different stuff or reposition the leg. I couldn't get all 6 legs to fit on an 80 millimeter base. It just wasn't going to work. So I decided, well, if I add some cork and some stuff, well, maybe I can fit 3 of the legs and make it look like it's working. So it took a lot of different work. Plus, you have to pin the legs themselves. Took a little bit of finesse, but I was able to make it work. Now, this also talks about variation models, and so you'll see the center one has one of the legs is really far reaching, like it's taking a big step, and the other one looks like it's just picking up the leg. So by creating different, poses, you can create a little bit of differentiation. The circle kind of shows a little bit of what I was talking about in terms of stippling on some highlights for battle damage, but also creating some interest a little bit. So again, just take a blister pack foam, lightly dab off a bunch of extra paint and start selectively picking out the edges of where you want it. Less is more here. Don't go too crazy. I think I may be a little too far with it. That's okay, because maybe I'll cut it back a little bit with the purples. And you can't quite see it, but on the lower parts of the leg, there is purple there, translucent purple from Pro Acryl. Again, your eyes don't pick it up right away, but now I've told you there's purple there. You'll look for it, and now you'll see it. But yeah, I kind of want to give some progress updates on seeing where these guys are at. I really like how I was able to go back and paint, using, I think it's Black Templar contrast paint. It's actually really good for this effect. It's able to it's more of a liquid base, but doesn't go everywhere on you like a wash, but also doesn't clump up like a standard GW paint. So it's kind of like a diluted GW paint. So this, I was able to kind of paint a few parts black to help break up all that metal. All that metal is a really big meal to try to take a bite into. So with adding some blacks, and I still have to go back and weather them, you're able to break up the surface a little bit in really meaningful ways. And it didn't take that long to go back and cut everything in. But now what I've done is shown you what's an example of the hot garbage phase right here. This is what everything looks like when it's super dark, super drab. Now I like to go back and start adding all the turquoise elements and bright emerald elements for the energy and things like that. So this is at the lowest point. This is the darkest point the model will be. Now we start adding highlights, and that's the fun part. So we say the fun part for the end is kind of a reward. But now the army, coming next week will really punch now that I've reached this point. But it took a long time to get here.
What are you going to do with the wraiths here? Like the wraiths obviously have some brighter spots already. What are we going to paint just like you were talking about, where you're hitting that top and making it go down from them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these wraiths look kind of like every other race that will be out there right now. But the next step will be the Carapace paint that like Incubi Darkness. And then I got to start going back and then figuring out what parts I want to be dark. And these models are a little tricky. I talked about painting, you have your bright chromes, but by adding some parts that are black, I got to figure out what I want to do. I know I want to make the blades black. Anything that's a blade or an actual weapon will be black. So for them, I'll use their blades as black. I think the particle beamer will be black. But now I'm going to figure out, do I want to actually take the time to paint anything else black? So I think by adding the armor, making that turquoise, that might help out a little bit. So now you got to make these decisions. They're kind of like time decisions. Hey, if I paint this, I got to paint it throughout the whole army. So maybe I just paint one thing at a time rather than paint one model up to a perfect standard and then realizing I don't have the time to paint everything up to that standard. So I recommend as you batch paint, just take it one step at a time, paint everything to completion, then pick another color, paint to completion. But maybe you choose not to paint certain things, but because you might not have the time, well, then circle back and paint them. So that's again another kind of tip a little bit. So that way you don't have one model when you go to play with it, it looks exactly how you want all the other models, but other models you didn't have time to paint up to that point. So with these rates, again, they're really just this very I would say dark metal right now, but I still have to add a lot of colors. But I want to give you a picture, kind of a before picture of them looking super drab. And then the race will be a huge point of this army. There's 18 of them. They're tall, they're massive, so they really need to pop. So some armies will have what's called a centerpiece model. That's your Magnus, Mortarion, something big that's really standing out, or it could just be a big unit there that's really singing. So for this army, yes, I'll have the Nightbringer, but it's not that big. So I think it's really gonna be the wraith. So you want to spend a lot of time on these wraiths if you have with whatever time you have left to make them really pop, because they're really gonna draw your eye when a judge is looking at your army.
Love it. So next time we'll have more progress updates. We'll have more work in progress photos, and then we're going to cover the bases and the display boards. So until next week, Mr. Matt Aaron, thanks for hanging out with us as always, and we will see you very soon for the next update. Until that day, Queens wave us out of here. See you on the flip side.